Well, we are live for another book club. Um, I am phoning in from undisclosed location uh, due to certain issues like family. And yeah, I've been experiencing the need for rest. Um, so I I'm gonna use that perspective to engage with this. Uh, we ended up talking about poison. We're gonna be talking about sin, nakedness, and falling. And then we'll do sleeping and working. There's kind of like different angles of approach. I have a lot of notes on this, so I hope you both are there with me with the amount of notes. um, but yeah, like I don't know. Like I guess my intention is related to taking a step back, uh, trying to find a new engagement. Um, there's I don't know that the frustration that I was having. I think I caught a hint of it in this chapter. Like there's a I don't know. I feel that there's an insistence on taking some perspectives like from the head, uh, like having a perspective from the head where this integration happens. So it's like, is the head really the head when this integration happens, right? And then you get into questions about sequence, questions about how to identify a whole, all of these things. So that they all pop up for me. Um, but maybe we'll kind of get to an answer here. I think um, maybe what's happening is that Matthieu is taking an eternal perspective instead of a temporal. Um, so I'd like you guys to weigh on in on this. Castle, do you wanna go next?
Sure. So, as always, life has been ever topical with the book club this past week, and I'm definitely with you there on the rest thing. I've had multiple people this week actually tell me that I need to stop and take a rest. Um, and there is this sort of interesting aspect that we'll be getting into of rest not as a failure to mediate, but a different type of mediation. Which is very interesting. I've been thinking on that a bit. I do have a good chunk of notes. I've been a little bit under the weather recently, and I actually have no idea why. And so I've been trying to address the discrepancies. I actually noticed that as I started feeling unwell, my push to try to artificially maintain my environment actually increased. So the amount of like cleaning and additional sort of things that I was doing, not just as a result of feeling unwell, but just in general, trying to like kind of keep from everything else falling. In addition, has been happening. So just that's the type of thing that's been on my mind. I've got a few insights that kind of just came up this morning that will come up here with respect to the cursed ground and that sort of thing. So I'm looking forward to these next couple chapters, and I think I'll stop for now right there. Elena, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. Um, so the rest thing is very um, relatable as well. It's something I've been grappling with like a couple of weeks now. Um, so I am looking forward to hearing your guys' thoughts on that. But in the meantime, I've also been thinking about dreaming and how the book talks about dreaming and how it does seem to be not a failure to mediate, like you were saying, Castle, but a different sort of mediation. So I'm looking to kind of think and delve into that. If anybody has any ideas on that, I also
Can you speak up a little bit, because I'm having a hard time following.
yeah. Do you want me to repeat that or
The last sentence, yeah,
just
the part about dreams.
yeah, like Castle was saying, the mediation of dreams seems to be not a failure to mediate between heaven and earth, but just a different sort of mediation. So I'm trying to understand how everybody else is interpreting and seeing that. I also do have to leave a little earlier today, so I'll probably just disappear in the middle.
Yeah, we can have an early end, because I don't feel like I want to go far because I'm with family, because I don't want to like go too far anyway. So do you want to expand a little bit? So you're saying you don't feel like when you fail to mediate dreams, you don't feel that as a failure compared to real life? Is that what you're saying?
No, uh, in the chapters that we were kind of talking about, he talks about in the three that we should be reading next. He talks about dreams as um, a microcosm of exile the in the biblical stories. So if dream is an exile, and if going into the wilderness has a purpose and there's something to learn there, I feel like dreaming in that state of sleep might also have that sort of aspect to it. So I'm trying to understand and get everybody's perspective.
Yeah, there's a healing quality in the dreaming. Yeah.
Christopher, you want to go?
I'm going to do a little bit of contrast with everyone else focusing on rest. I feel like I got enough rest now, and I'm ready to get back to work. Building and revivifying things. So that's kind of how I'm
Okay,
thinking about stuff.
that's great. And we got someone from Twitter, Francisco. He's joining us. Welcome. Um, if you're watching on the YouTubes, I'm gonna post a link if you want to hop in, or you're invited to and join in the discussion with comments, especially since we have a low attendance on the panel today. The more input is better. So since I came really in time, I gotta load the thing. Oh, we got a Mark in the audience. Where is so yeah, does anyone want to take us off on chapter 59, or do we want to readdress something from last week? This is another. There we go. So in the first part, they're talking about the making of the girdle from the fig leaves, right? And it will talk about the clothing as a covering, a artificial covering. But we already mentioned last week that the girdle is a specific type of covering, right? It's around the waist. It has to do with faith and with righteousness. So we can imagine, right, that as if you fail to cover, that the body part that you fail to cover matters. Like we'll not go into this right now, but there's certain dimensions and complexity that gets into later in the Bible. But other types of clothing are cloaks, right? So cloaks cover the whole body. Then there's coloring of the of the clothing. There's materials of the clothing as well, right? So here we're dealing with fig leaves, relating to the fig tree. We already posited that if you put fig leaves on your body, you take on the qualities of the tree a little bit, right? And this has to do with you standing up, being a mediator. I don't know if that's in this chapter.
I think it is a little bit just with the that it'll be on the third page of this, that he needs to rectify the exposed flesh of his body by fixing its discrepancies with his mind, and then talks a little bit about the leaves.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if we go to the graph, right, we are seeing a problem, right? So the nakedness, right, and this framing is in a sinful human, right? So it's weird to me, right? Because is a sinful human a principality, right? Is something that's not working a actual thing, right? So here we're getting it. Go ahead.
I was just going to suggest that maybe that label of sinful human refers to the entire thing, because that would make sense since there's two on the two question marks at the bottom as well, rather than the white principle at the top.
Yeah, fair enough, right? But the idea of the whole things is that they exist by virtue of the head, right? So the head gives the structure of the whole thing, right? And so the sinful head, if you look at this graph, would be giving an incomplete structure, right? Or a dysfunctional structure, right? And maybe what he's trying to do here is that he's presupposing that you need clothing as a sinful human, right? And then if you presuppose that you need clothing, then the nakedness is not having a proper body, right? And the clothedness is having a proper body. I think that's probably the way to read this, right? So we have Adam in in a secondary stage, right? Like, so he's already eaten from the fruit of the tree, and now we have this irreversible state, right? Like the net, and in this secondary state, we need covering, and so if that covering doesn't happen, then the body can't complete. But if we have proper covering, then we can have a healthy body. Does that fit for everybody?
At least artificially, like, is kind of trying to rectify. I just want to kind of add one quick thing, that this diagram is going to be carried into the next one. And so to your point about is the sinful human like a proper principality, like in the next page in the series of diagrams, we'll see that the head quickly falls underwater. So we'll also, like, this is kind of like the moment just before collapse that we're also seeing here.
Well, yeah, I don't know. Like, I actually think this is an existential state, right? So after Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden, right? Like, now we have a new normal, right? And so in the new normal, we need to cover ourselves, like it's not optional, and we need to have things support us, right? Because if they don't support us, then we disintegrate. So I think that's what it's talking about, right? And so it's using the human frame, right? And so, like, what is when the bottom is failing, right? Like, that's when the feet aren't supporting or touching the ground properly, right? And then you fall down, right? So that's one way of understanding, right? And you can also take like a wheel, right? Like what happens is if a wheel falls, right, like it rolls, so you have a revolution, right? So you can also look at that framing. And yeah, in some sense you can say that, like, where's the fault, right? Is the fault in the support, or is the fault in the head failing to integrate? And probably the fault is in the middle, right? Because the head needs to adjust for the incompetence of the feet, right? Like it needs to produce new covering, new clothing, right? And the feet need to conform to the clothing, right? So like there's a both there's a cooperation of both aspects, and if one of them doesn't fully show up, then it doesn't work. Or if one is actually broken, right? Like if you just crush your feet, like it doesn't really matter what you put on there, right? Like you can't stand on it.
So what do you think of Mark's suggestion in the comments that all sin is from the head?
Well, I think all sin implicates the head, right? So like the head is responsible, the head is directive, right? So if something happens, the head needs to adjust. Like if you stumble, right, like you need to what's it called, we catch your balance, right? So in that sense, the head is implicated, right? But the source of the sin doesn't have to be the head. That's
Yeah.
but I
think,
don't even know if it matters. That's the other part. Like,
yeah, he goes in on the first part here. He mentions like the tug of war between time and space in the first paragraph there. But I think the tug of war, like, well, the idea of a tug of war comes from the fact that there's improper mediation between the two. Like, you just have you have the time and space, and they work together when they're properly mediated together. And when that doesn't happen, then there's like a tug of war between like the head and the feet, maybe, you know. So it's like when you stumble, it might not be the fault of the head or of the feet, but something in between that's causing, the lack of balance or whatever.
Yeah, like someone else could knock you over, there could be a hard wind or something like that, like there's stuff that just kind of happens.
Right.
And that, so you're not like morally culpable, for example, if like you slip on the ice or something like that. Although there is, with proper mediation, maybe you can kind of plan for certain stuff or avoid certain areas and that sort of stuff. But if this type of thing happens like by surprise, then it's maybe a failure to mediate, or maybe it's just, you just had an incomplete data set or something like that.
Yeah. It might not be you that's failing to mediate. You're like reacting to some other failure to mediate from someone else, maybe. So or something else. Yeah.
Well, I got a question for you guys. Don't you think that would also happen in the garden?
Well, like slipping?
Right, or winds or whatever. Like external factors that impose on the body.
Probably not. I mean, so there's something that's going to come up here with on the next page about the ground being cursed, and I have some notes on that. This aspect of curse is very closely related to course, or also to run. So the sort of thing of like the ground runs because of you. Like there's this aspect of you go to toil and get the fruits of your labors, and what you get instead is like some other random thing. You wind up getting thorns or weeds and all these other things, whereas like that was not really the case before. So you had a sort of predictable, safe environment before that. But now in many ways, if the ground is running, and I was thinking about this with respect to like you get the rug pulled out from under you, right? And like another name for a type of rug is also a runner. I just thought was interesting. There's connections too with like the word rug goes back to like a piece of rough skin or shaggy hair.
Rugged.
What?
Rugged.
And so you have all of those aspects, and it's like, but if you're standing on that, and all of a sudden like the ground is running, that it's like trying to stand still on a treadmill or something like that. So you probably wouldn't have hazards or something like that. But I guess now that like the mediation issue would become something at like a higher scale, I guess. So like on the personal scale, the person can wind up slipping and it's not their fault, but also because of failure to mediate, maybe in the garden, for example, then these other people who are doing their best at the same level that maybe someone could have mediated back then when things weren't so extreme. Now that's not enough.
Yeah, maybe. So I went to the second page. Did you guys want to do something on the first page still, or?
I just want to make a quick note, just that he does make kind of a subtle reference that he'll talk about a little later here, that falling is the result of failing to support the hierarchy of the body. But I highlighted like just before of the body, so you could easily go to the communal or intercommunal scales and this aspect of impiety. Like, so especially since we're talking about nakedness, I think a lot about just the impiety of Ham with exposing the nakedness of his father. We won't talk about spies for like a long time, I don't think, but there is that aspect of failing to support his father, essentially. And then that results in sort of an exposure of the nakedness. Like it wasn't a problem for Noah to be asleep in his own tent in his own bed, being like unclothed, like that was fine. But it was the failure to support from the other people who should be mediating that is creating the upset and winds up essentially in a fall of the mediator who should have been, keeping the tent closed but didn't.
Mm-hmm. And so there's other references to tents, right? And tents are a covering of a family, I think, right? They're housing a family. So like Noah isn't naked, right? Because he got a tent. He's naked in the tent.
Right.
And so if you enter the tent and you don't, or like container, right? Like if you enter the container, but you disrespect the functionality of the container, right? Which is basically covering Noah, then you cause a problem.
It's like you think like middle school bullies have kind of figured this out. It's like the person can be perfectly clothed, but if a middle school bully goes to his classmate and tears his jeans down or something like that, like it wasn't the person who got pants' fault, right? It's just like that just is something that was a malevolent mediation on the part of his classmate that did that. But it's like, yeah, there was an artificial covering, but I like that point that you can have various different scales of artificial covering, and if you're well nested within that, like it kind of doesn't matter until someone like rips the veil off.
Yeah, I was thinking also on Noah there, when his one son realizes that he's naked in the tent, his impulse, whatever, is to go and further uncover him, basically by telling everybody about it. Where the other two, they come in and add covering to him, which is the right response there. So
right, and to go back to I think it's a past slide, right? So it's like extra uncovering is disintegration, right? And recovering is supporting, right? So there's a explicit movement there that's symbolized by either side. Yeah, good point.
I think there's something useful about contrasting where we had the two wrongs make a right thing before, but also there is this aspect of just piling on more trouble, and it's not the same thing to go and flip the boat a second time, as if it's like, oh, there was something that happened within the hierarchy, and the CEO has been exposed as making the stupid mistake or something like that. Let's now pile on and start exposing even more mistakes that he made. It's like, no, that's not the same thing as rectifying the thing with the second properly calibrated wrong.
So on the top of the next page, we encounter the word shame, right? And I've been thinking a bit about what is shame. Like shame is the recognition of an insufficiency, right? Like there's a lack there. There's the inability to cover, right? Like the fact that you're not covered says something about you. Now I like the bully example, right? Like when the bully pulls down your pants, right? It's like you weren't able to defend yourself from having your pants pulled down, right? Like so you got unawares, right? So that exposes you as vulnerable, right? Like on multiple levels, right? It's not only the level that you're vulnerable because now you got your pants on your ankles, and you literally can't support yourself because like you can't move anymore, right? Like now you're a sitting target. But also spiritually, right? Like you've basically you're exposed as a victim, right? Like you can't be victimized, and that says something about you. And I thought that like when you're bullied like that, it's really hard to defend yourself, right? Like what's the basis on which you can even counter that except aggression and dominance over the bully?
Yeah, and I'm thinking again about the girdle thing too. Is that it's a lot less easy for somebody to do that to you if you have a belt on. So there is a little bit of an aspect of that.
Well, yeah, well that is a level of protection, right? Like the belt, like that's preempting that attack in some profound way. So yeah, that's or suspenders even. Like,
yeah.
So yeah, that's. But yeah, so this shame element, right, is like the pressing need to defend yourself, right, or rectify things, and yeah, like I like this idea, right? Like it says the inability to cover the body with the spirit, right? So there's a spiritual reality that allows you to be defended, right? So the fact that you stand up and you put your suspenders on every morning is a spiritual reality that allows you that when the attack of pantsing occurs, then you're not going to be vulnerable, right? Like the same thing is like, oh, like if you train every day in martial arts, right? Like when you actually get attacked, now you have integrated all of these qualities, right? These affordances so that you can respond appropriately.
And there's also the aspect of like the signal that's put out just from having that, so it's like if the bully sees that you're wearing a belt, then it's like the attack is less likely to happen. Same thing if oh, this guy has a reputation for training in martial arts all the time. Maybe just maybe that guy never actually needs to put it into like practical use out on the street because people just are kind of aware of like even just the way he holds himself. But maybe also if he's going to the same place all the time, probably frequents the same place, people have seen him, so it's like less likely to get involved just by the fact that he's kind of artificially covered in that way.
Right, and it's also posture, right? Like there's a bunch of things that signal competence in some sense or integration, right?
Okay.
Well, you see with criminals, rapists or whatever, right? Like they have this sensitivity for people who are able to be victimized.
I was about to say that, yeah.
Yeah, there's some spiritual signaling going on there, right?
Yeah. They can even, I think it was something that Jordan Peterson brought up, that I guess there was some sort of thing where they like surveyed like imprisoned like actual diagnosed psychopaths, and like just as part of like a social big science thing, they they show them like just videos of like people walking down the street, and like they knew like whether or not these people walking had been like victimized within the past year or something like that, and the people could actually reliably predict who had been recently attacked, and that the fact that they had been recently attacked made them a prime target for doing it again.
Yeah. So then we have the other side of the equation. Dying refers to the gradual estrangement of the spirit from the body. So the way that I looked at that is it's a disconnection from the source, right? Like, so you don't get fed. Like the body doesn't get fed by the spirit, and so like the body is hungering, but it, yeah, like it doesn't get food, right? So then it gets food from somewhere else, right? Which is basically random, and then it becomes unmanageable. So in that sense, it doesn't even, right? Like if it gets another source, right? You if you scale this up to a community, right? Like if someone comes in with a bunch of money, right, into a village, right, and just buys a bunch of people, right, like they get food from another source, right, and they become disconnected from the village community, and like that can go as far that the whole community falls apart because the the integration, right, the interreliance, the authority of the spirit of the village gets overruled by this external source that has more influence, right? I've seen a bunch of shows about Western villages that get like big industry coming in or whatever, right? And then everything goes insane. Yeah, so it's interesting in the way that he formulates it, right? So and I think this is maybe what Mark was talking about, right? So it's privileging the spirit, right? Like the spirit estranges from the body. It doesn't say that the body estranges from the spirit. So I don't know if that's intentional, but you kind of have to say like the spirit is primary, right? Because it's like the spirit is that which gives identity.
Yeah, I think it's like it as the spirit is no longer properly covering, that it's kind of like a recession in a sense, that as that kind of the will extending to kind of stretch out the heavens and make the spirit cover, as you kind of do that less and less, that you wind up like the passions wind up taking over even more. You wind up with sensitivity to addictions, all these sort of things, and then you end up with some sort of thing like death, and at that point there's a complete sort of receding at that point. Like there's no more mediation at that point.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. What provides covering from above whatever is the telos or final cause for what's happening. Mm-hmm. And then we support things by submitting to that. The submission to the structure provides the support for it.
Right.
I think.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I was thinking about how to like do a talk on modesty for some students, while also talking about like a bunch of the other sort of thing like speech and humor and those sorts of things. But to briefly go over, clothing and this sort of thing, that especially in a sacred space, you do these things. But what if a person is like genuinely like impoverished? Like they actually can't, they don't have to be all like dressed super fancy or anything like that, but they actually don't have, like young man only has cargo shorts. Like that's all he has, to go to, something that's nice. And I was thinking about this thing of, that you can, if that's really your condition, then clothe yourself in humility, right? That's actually that's all you got. Like, this is just your situation. But also, while you're at it, clothing yourself in humility, ask one of the other people who actually has somebody to buy you some real clothes. But that it's like there is kind of a necessity on the communal scale that if you can't actually mediate on your own, like there's no need to be an individual in that right. And you do wind up having to kind of outsource even for these sorts of things. Ultimately, like with the Adam and Eve thing, like God winds up giving them better clothes. Like they tried to serve themselves by making the girdles of the leaves, and then in the end, God winds up giving them the stuff. So it's like they could have also still gone and been like, "Hey, God, we're naked. Can you please give us some clothes?" And like He clearly did it later.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that if you go back to the Asian shows that I watched, there's two responses to sin from the lower part, right? So one response is to deny, right? So you're basically trying to sustain the facade, but if there's a recognition that no, like there's no way that I can maintain my innocence, then it's complete submission, right? It's like, okay, like I surrender to you, to your judgment now, right? Like I deserve to die because that's the consequence of my action. And then you can reestablish me in the hierarchy, right? You can clothe me again, but that's up to you. Like you get to decide what place I get assigned and what is appropriate for me in order to redeem myself, right? And so it's interesting because in some sense, right, like if you don't have proper clothing for the dress code, whatever, when you show up, right, it's like, well, like what do you do, right? But you can't force your way in just because you have an invitation, right? Because you don't meet the requirements. So like there needs to be a negotiation, right? And like someone needs to make a decision whether the dress code is more important or your presence.
And there's the aspect of being underdressed. Like that doesn't just mean that your body isn't clothed. Like you could be wearing, like a prison jumpsuit or something like that. You show up to a place, you're completely clothed, head to toe and everything. But then if there's a bunch of people at like a black tie event, it's like, yeah, you're underdressed. There is an aspect of nakedness of showing up in, like a Easter bunny suit or something like that to something that's actually formal.
Easter bunnies. But even just you have just a nice dress, right?
Right.
But you're not within the style that is expected, right? And like as a consequence, like people will look at you strange, right? Because like you're signaling like I'm not part of you, like and then it's like
especially like the black tie event type stuff where it's like there is other formal stuff and that's like on that same level, but then you're sticking out like a sore thumb.
Right, and so the question is, right, like if you look at the bottom graph, it's like, okay, like you might be able to sustain someone being underdressed, right? But that might also make the event fall, right? So you might have a consequence that like next time, right, like next year or whatever in the gala, like 10 people are going to underdress instead of one, right? And then instead of falling, like failing to meet up to the principle, you end up dying, right? Because like now the essence of what you're participating in changes, right? Like it's no longer the same thing, and then it cannot also not fulfill the same role, right? Like because it changed what it is, right? So there's a purity or whatever, right? Like there's a reason to reject people based upon maintaining the coherence before the dying sets in.
Have you ever been to a place that did? Like for me, I've had this in even like volunteer organizations or even at school where they would normally have a uniform, but then they would do like a casual Friday type thing, but no one told you. So you show up in the actual uniform and everyone else is in normal clothes. And like, that's an experience of nakedness as well. Like you're actually maintaining the normal order, but because of they're having like a little jubilee, like the straight man is now the person who's completely exiled. And and naked instead.
Right, but that's like a different order, right? Like that's the cool order, right? Like that's like a fashion order instead of while the other order is like integrated in the purpose of the school or whatever, right? So but that's interesting, right? Because that jubilee or whatever, like in some sense, is a rebellion, and so like that's fine if that rebellion is then resubmitted to the school, right? Because then you have like a carnival effectively. But if it's not, then you get two heads, right? And now they're in competition.
It's also like working on the Sabbath, like deliberately going, not like, oh, you know, my car broke down and I have to handle this repair really quick or something like that before Monday comes around. But like, oh, I'm just going to decide to, or even worse, make other people work, you know? And it's like that sort of thing. If you know, like if you're ignorant, then, fair enough. But if someone is deliberately doing that itself is a sort of rebellion. Like not resting is also a sort of rebellion as well.
Yeah, good point. So if we go to the nakedness, falling, and returning to dust at the second part, Adam says, "Cursed is the God says, sorry, cursed is the ground because of you." And this is interesting, right? So he's basically saying that Adam's influence, right, or effect on the ground is a curse, right? So he's not a blessing. He's disintegrating the ground, right? In other words, right? You could explain it as Adam has dominion, right? But because he's not adhering to God, right? He's in sin. He's trickling that down onto the ground, right? So the ground that he's working on is in sin. Right? And then you will eat from it, right? So what are you eating? Well, it's the fruits, right? So in some sense it's like you raise up the ground again, right? But it's raised up to feed you instead of to give glory to God. And that's what the thorns and thistles then end up being, right?
I found it interesting, this bit about the God saying to the snake, "You are cursed more than any animal of the field." Not like you are the one cursed animal or any of these things. Just more than all the other ones, you're cursed. But it makes me think of that thing of the etymology of curse. That you will now have to run, or now you're going to be on the move more than all of the other ones. Like you're no longer going to have. And there's an interesting aspect of also kind of like losing legs and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I was just like, okay, now like your stability is completely gone. Like also your ability to like have a home and all these other things. Like you're just going to be on the move all the time compared to the other guys.
Right, and so like a little bit further, he's also making a comment about the snake, and I think that is preceding this in the Bible, right, where the snake is the most naked, right, and I think he's putting slippery in connection to that, right, but what does it mean to be the most naked, right? Like it means also to be the most intangible, right? The most ineffable, the most ingraspable, right? Like that's what slippery is also referring to, right? Like it's the ability to take hold, and so you can take hold of the snake, right? And so another problem with that is the ability to name, right? You can't name the snake, right? So if the snake comes at you and tells you something, you don't know where it's coming from, right? You can't identify the source of that, right? And so if you if you say, well, how does that connect to this, right? You curse more than any animal, right? Like, well, like the thing that that you can't identify, you can't grasp, wherever, right? That's the thing you can build upon the least, right? Like it's the least reliable thing, right? Like it's the most mutatable. It's the source, the essence of change in some sense, right? Um,
I was looking a little bit at this. Oh, go ahead, please.
Oh, I was just going to say that another word that he uses in relation to the snake in this book, I think, is subtle. So that would make sense with what Randy was saying. Subtlety is hard to grasp and kind of manipulate in any way. But after your comment, Castle, there's an interesting question in the comments, I think, since you brought up etymology. Go ahead.
Well, I want to address actually the first thing that she said, because that's related to what I have a note on. So this aspect of subtle, I was thinking about like nakedness as lack of concealment or just being unconcealed. And so there is this aspect of, okay, it seems like, well, I was thinking about this with respect to disguise. So you have, or changeable skin, for example, but a thing of being unconcealed, and then at the same time subtlety is plainness. So like if you had, and like if something's very plain, like that's kind of difficult to name, where it's like, oh, there's not really like any characteristics of this that really stand out to me at all. Like this is just, it's just, there he is. Like it's just this is whatever this thing is. Like, what do you even call this? And it just walks up to you, and it's just a very plain sort of creature that doesn't seem like it's trying to, conceal itself or anything like that. There is something that's a little bit, I guess, kind of interesting about that, but also still very slippery. Like, if there's something where it's like, oh, there's this guy has no noticeable characteristics, and then especially you think of like, criminals that go and they try to make themselves as subtle as possible, very kind of approachable or whatever, but nothing about them actually sticking out or memorable that you could kind of, communicate otherwise. Like there is a sort of advantage in that if you're going to be malicious and being a very, sort of forgettable.
well, it's not only forgettable, but it's also trustworthy. Because if you're naked, you're known, right? In some profound sense. Like if I can see you, and if I can see you, why wouldn't I trust you?
No.
Right? So if it, so the and the devil, right? Like he doesn't lie, right? Like in some sense, it's like you can see, literally see and understand what he has to offer, right? Like that's why you say yes. Like that's literally the reason you jump in, because it's a proposition that you're willing to take, right? Like maybe you can see the consequences, right? And that's also with the snake, right? Like in some sense, the snake's proposition immediately is correct, right? Like it, there's no, you could say, materialistic implications, just spiritual implications, or you could say, right, like in the immediate temporal space, there's not much of an effect, right? Like it's like uh, taking a drink has immediate temporal effects, right? But you don't get addicted by taking one drink, right? But you open the door of becoming a drunk, right? And like that's the thing you don't see, right? Like that's the hidden thing that gets snuck in.
Well, the propositions might be correct, but the participation is wrong. So,
and there's sort of an aspect too of a, I'm thinking of the uniform. So I'm pretty sure I've seen Matthieu talk about something like this before. This thing of, that if you're a spy, or if you're trying, you have like an inside man at an institution or something like that for committing a crime, like the person is supposed to look as much like the other people. And that there is an aspect of that also, of if everyone is in uniform and everyone kind of sees all these other people who are, it's like, okay, yeah, like I can identify this guy, but there is a sort of nakedness in the uniform. Like, oh, well, he's not anything else. He's just this. There's this very much a sort of subtlety to the identity of the people who are all wearing the same uniform all at once. And so you can have someone that goes, and if there is someone like pretending to work someplace, which is definitely something that's happened before, people that have pretended to be surgeons and have gotten away with it for years, that a person can go and just start doing something, you know, and it's like maybe they're just an idiot, like maybe they're not actually evil or something like that, but like they're just so subtle that no one is actually able to name them as, oh, this is an imposter, oh, this guy actually doesn't have, he actually doesn't know what he's talking about. And that there is also that aspect of the lies where it's like, yeah, the immediate effects are not a lie. Like, oh, you won't die for certain. It's like, yeah, well, not immediately. And then, you know, like he doesn't even have to have access to the information. It almost makes it worse that he doesn't have access to the other information. He's telling them something with near certainty that, oh, you won't definitely die, you know, but it's like he doesn't know that. Like there's not, it's like how is he more of an expert than the people who literally heard it from God themselves, or you know, at least Adam did. And so there is that bit of it's like, why are you taking this guy as an authority, but he's presenting it with confidence of, oh yeah, you know, for sure. And ultimately, like, you know, there are the layers of not being wrong. Like, sure, Adam and Eve were eventually, like, you know, raised from the dead and made saints. Like, okay, like that's just, you know, so it's like, did they die for certain, like actually ever, you know? And like, but at the same time, that's still evil. There's still something very evil to still being completely right. Like that's the sort of thing where we talk about, like, you can't just have one of the true, the good, or the beautiful. Like you can actually just say something that's true, and you can actually, it can always be true, and yet like it can still be evil.
So I've been thinking a lot about this pattern that I'm noticing, right? So people who don't want to accept things, they point towards the exception, right? So what is the snake doing? Well, he's pointing towards the exception, right? I mean, you don't have to die, right? Like that's correct, right? Like in some sense, he's making the proposition, right? Like, okay, you you embrace change, right? And emergence happens, right? And emergence can be good, right? Like, yes, correct. Does that mean that you should embrace the emergence? No, right? But it's like a lens, right? Are you focusing on what God says and says, okay, like, yeah, just don't do that because it's a bad idea, right? Like that doesn't mean that you can't do it, right? Like that's like no, like every argument that I'm hearing is like, well, like why don't we just let people do it, right? Because they want to, and like, who are you to disagree with these people on what they want? Like, yeah, like it's not about whether you can or cannot do something; it's whether you should or shouldn't do something. And and yeah, so it's kind of hard, right? Like when you keep pointing at and the consequence, or not the consequences, the exceptions, right? Like on the consequences, like, oh, like this person jumped off a 5-story high building and they walked away fine. It's like, yeah, okay, okay, like it's like don't jump off the 5-story building. Like it's like even if someone managed to just get out of it, okay. And and so like what ends up happening when you're in these discussions with people or whatever, right? Like you end up well, like that's what a red herring is, right? Like you end up chasing or discussing an aspect of what you're talking about without dealing with the essence, with the actual problem, right? And then especially on social media, right, like you get like 4 or 5 steps in and nobody knows what they're talking about anymore. Nobody knows what's important, what's being discussed, right? Like everybody's like, well, you're not listening to me, right? It's because like, yeah, like if you're bringing in an exception, like I'm not going to listen to you. It's like I'll grant you the exception. Like I don't care about the exception. Let the exception be the exception. Like can we talk about things that matter here? Like I'm not going to organize the world to fit the exception. I'm going to organize the world so that things can be working properly, and then we deal with the exceptions when we meet them. So yeah, that's kind of to go back that's the snake, right? Like the snake is the seduction to deal with the accepted element. Uh,
I see that people are going off in the comments, but I quickly want to mention that
I'm not seeing the comments, so like
no,
that's I've been.
well, that sounds like bliss. The
Oh, there we go. I
yeah.
had to refresh it. Okay.
I was thinking about this aspect of dressing and addressing. So the sort of thing of you have a person that say this is like the leader of an organization or a high status person that is called out for some sort of thing. You know, so they go and they say, "Oh, you made this mistake." Maybe it was an actual mistake, or maybe it's just people who are mad at them, or something like that. And they want them to go and publicly address the situation. Like there is sort of an aspect of on the more communal scale trying to cover yourself or maybe cover for someone else and giving an explanation for something so that the as Matthieu kind of mentions here that there's the nakedness, the falling, and the death are all sort of linked. That if there's an aspect of nakedness that, and thinking also of like the person having their pants pulled down, like also there's a possibility of them falling now that they essentially have like denim shackles around their ankles, that their mobility is limited unless they address this very quickly. So if a person is called out for, oh, you are exposed for having done this thing, that they have to stop and address that and give an explanation or disavow, no longer support the thing that they're doing, or else then there's the threat of, fall and death that goes along with that.
Yeah, I like that, right? The exposure in an argument, right? Like I expose the flaw in your reasoning by presenting the exception. Like, oh, your framework isn't airtight, right? And then we go back to Gödel's incompleteness. It's like, yeah, no framework is airtight, and I see the comments in in the comment section talking about language, right? Like language is also a logical structure, right? Which can be complete, right? And like symbolism is like a skeleton. I think the best way to look at it, right? Like it's a skeleton that can sustain life, right? And the life is, if we use the language of the book, right? It's time having impact on structure or hierarchy, right? And that brings life, right? And so if you take the framework of the garden, right? Basically where you keep eating the fruits and not falling over, right? Or not being naked, if you keep in that process, right, like you are alive where the head is in proper authority, enacting proper authority over the body, right, or the principle is properly guiding, right, or the telos is properly structured. So I think it's important to think about that the symbolism, right, is a means of ordering or approaching or engaging things in the world, and then you have to have wisdom with the symbolism to properly contextualize it, right? You put the symbolic structure in the environment that it has, right, and then you read what you can know about it, and then you can inform your actions. And if we want to go to language, like language is a way that humans express themselves. I was actually talking with my parents about the Adam's apple, right? Because that has a really interesting name, right? And the apple is a fruit, right? And it's at the point where your breath goes through, and it helps with forming the sounds that you're making, right? So there's an element where this Adam's apple is like the image of God speaking, right? Like it's the image of the word in man. Um, and you if you take a little bit of a leeway there, right? Like the apple is the fruit, right? So like the fruit allows us to transform the spirit that we're expressing into words, and let us be like gods, right? Like that's kind of like, okay. Some heavy spiritual symbolism there. So I was connecting that back to the language discussion that's being had, right? And how symbolism is maybe the way to look at symbolism is what allows you to form proper language, right? Or what allows you to form language in adherence to God instead of to yourself.
Or it's just a separate navigational tool, because you can't rely on one. Right? If you try to rely on something like language to do all the things in the world, it doesn't work at all. And we know, like, we see this all the time. Right? We see it all the time. And you can't, legalism doesn't work. We already know this, right? You can't mediate out of wars with contracts or treaties, right? Because they're based in, to be fair, a particular type of language, right? And while you can argue that there is a language of creation, right? So that's the title of the book. You can't reduce what the symbolism is pointing at to the spoken or written language, because there's more than one type of language. There's body language, for example, and I think that's where people get massively confused, and that's why I think that pointing out the fact that there are patterns, and language, we'll say written or spoken, generally deals with objects or things and actions, and that's it. All right. And then either the relationship is inferred, or you partially make relationships explicit, right? But you can't fully make relationships explicit, because relationships have depth, and language is a compression or a flattening. Then the issue that you run into is, well, are things that are, we'll say, on the vertical causality scale language? And I would say no. That's all symbolic. Once you get to the up down, you're in symbol mode. And the one thing that I think we were struggling with earlier is, you got to be careful of scale, especially in this book, because he changes scale and he relates scales to each other. But that doesn't mean that the rules up here apply down here, or vice versa, right? Like, the body does not sin against the head when it's a single person. That doesn't happen, right? But the body can sin against the head when it's a family, and that happens all the time.
What do you
Right?
mean the body
and
doesn't sin against the head? Like, you can have spasms or whatever. Like, I don't.
That's not a sin against the head. That's just the body being the body. Like, the body doesn't have will.
But it's not
Sin
adhering to
actually
the
requires will.
spiritual covering. Like,
The body doesn't have will. Sin is a function of will. Like, otherwise, you're completely screwed. Because if sin isn't a function of will, then there's nothing you can do about your sin, right? And that's what that's basically what the religious traditions do. Is they, all of them, doesn't matter where you go, they all have a version of sin, right? And so what that means is that in order to get out of that or avoid it to the degree that you can, because there's sin above you and that's coming down upon you. There's, the sins of the father. You're not getting around that, right? There's the sin of Adam and Eve. You're not getting around that, but you're not getting around certain sin, right? It's not, but it's above you, right? But you can control the sin below you. You don't have to listen to whatever the snake was before it was a snake, right? That was a choice. That was your will, right? And therefore, sin is a function of will. Sin is, it's not only a function of will, but at the level of a single person, sin is all about will, right? And your will has to align with what's above, and that's good too, right? Because it allows you to make mistakes without sinning, right? And the inverse too, like you can sin without, quote, making a mistake. That's actually really important. And this is the problem with mixing the scales, right? Is that people get very confused because they say, well, it works for the government. It's like, but you're not the government. In fact, something works for the government doesn't mean it will work for you, right? You can't tax your village because the mayor did. You're not the mayor. It's not that hard, right? But people get confused and they try to apply what they see as how things work, which is almost never correct, by the way, because you can't see the things above you clearly. You're too small at the scale that they exist, and then everything gets confused. And so this is I think I brought it up before, maybe not here, but I brought it up before elsewhere on Navigating Patterns for sure. This is why when people say communism works at the layer of the family, that is correct. Where no socialist form of government ever works at the scale of a person, right? Because there's only one person there, right? And so you can apply the, needs and wants argument there, right? You can say, okay, well, each person, we've just said there's only one, should get according to their needs, right? And that should be somehow provided, but there's only one person, and the only way to provide is from a person, right? And so they would do all the work, which is also fine, right? Right. But also socialism doesn't work, we'll say, above the scale of the family. Why? Because it kills millions of people. And if you can't figure out why, that's fine. But also we know this happens reliably 100% of the time. So that's good to know. We don't need to understand why, but like you really should be able to figure it out pretty quick, right? Because it's a trick. And I have a video on that on Navigating Patterns. Like if you can't figure it out, there's a video on the trick of socialism. There it is. It's just play a simple trick on you. But it's important to remember that these rules say at your scale, well, what does it take for me not to sin? Well, your will, right? That's what it takes, right? But there's pre-existing sin that had nothing to do with you, right? That you got caught up in, or that you're the victim of even, right? And there's nothing you can do about that because you don't operate one scale up, right? But that doesn't mean you have no involvement in it, right? You need to pray for the sinners, right? Wherever they are. And that's where, this is where things break down because people want to have control of things above them, we'll say, control of the family, control of the government, control of all these other people, right? And you're never going to have that. You're not, it's not going to happen, right? But there's things you can do, but they all involve your will. And if your will is busy trying to do those things, which you can't do because it's not attached, right? You're part of the bodies above you, but you're not the head. And so you don't have responsibility for or control over the sin of those larger bodies, at least not in that way. But you if you're involved, if you're trying to involve yourself in that, you're not involving yourself in making sure you don't sin in with your body, all right? Because you're substituting the body that you have control over, basically, and you can't do that. Right? You're not going to make you're not going to make porn disappear, right? Like that's not going to happen. And even if you did, it wouldn't work. Like it wouldn't have that effect because the problem, that's the end result of the problem. That's not the problem, right? You're not going to make all governments be good, because the goodness and badness is a manifestation of the government, right? And it's inevitable because it's not perfect. And you can always judge it as good or bad based on your perspective. It doesn't even matter what it is. And that's the problem, is that if you try to control that, it's not under your will, right? The things under your will are the things under your head, basically, and attached to you directly. There's nothing you can do. And this is a big problem, especially with like raising children, right? People say like, oh, you know, you've got your child, whatever, and your child is wild and out of control, and that's your fault. It's like, well, at some point, children grow up, and at some point in their growing up, they're no longer in your body. They're no longer under your control. The process of growing up is gaining more and more of your autonomy. Well, where do you gain it from? You gain it from your parents and eventually from your immediate surroundings. And then you can, refute that.
So
right? But that's the process of becoming, we'll say, quote, independent.
So I want to add something to your point about just to add a little more contrast to the bit about the body not sinning because it doesn't have the will in itself. That there is this aspect of, you know, that I don't have to like go to confession for temptations, right, or something like that. Like a person can actually, and this is something that was like well documented with like, you know, the church fathers that lived out as hermits in the middle of the desert and stuff, where that they would just actually go and just have temptations constantly, like actually constantly. But that because they weren't consenting to it, that was not sin. Like it might have made it impossible for them to actually get anything done because they're just constantly trying to capture their thoughts and, you know, do something else. And maybe it's actually that hard that they're just dealing with these things. But there is an important distinction of knowing that the body or like the tumult of the senses or whatever you would call it is probably rebelling against you. But that's kind of like the ground is cursed. Like, you know, the thing upon which you're standing is running. But it's not necessary to be like you have to be responsible for it, but it's not your fault per se.
Yeah, but that's now we're getting into the question of identity, right? Who are you, right? And you're the head, not the tail, right? So the point where the sin is not in you, right, is because you're the head. Like you are not your body, right? But that doesn't mean that your body isn't in sin towards the head. Like I think that's just wrong. Like I think there is in your body, like physically, there's just motor things that are not responding or corresponding to your will, right? And like the framing that they're having here, right? It's an inability to support the head, right? And you could frame it as well, like as a human, I'm failing because I don't know, like I didn't do martial arts, so I don't have proper relationship with my body or whatever, right? So I can't exert the control that I theoretically could have, right? And you can say that, well, that's a sin of the head, but I think both of these things are actually at work at once. And I think it's just wrong to say that there's no will below you. That's just doesn't make, like there's maybe no intention below you, but like I don't know about no will.
So if I could maybe add a little bit, just kind of the perspective that I'm understanding, that there's this aspect, and I'm thinking also you used a definition, I think it was from Dutch, with sin as waste. And so this thing of a kind of a mediation failure or something like that is a different sort of definition than maybe the common definition that I am going with like if you commit the sin, then you have to be, you know, like God has to forgive you for this or something like that. Whereas just being like a muppet or not being able to control your stuff is, you know, there's waste taking place there. But it's not necessarily something that is like, oh, you know, God's going to be mad at you because you tripped over a rock or something like that.
No, yeah, but that's the question of responsibility, right? Are you responsible for like a spasm that you have, or like no, right? Like that's something that happens without outside of your will, right? Like
Well, I mean, I think the issue is if Like, babies can't hold their own head up, but babies are usually seen as innocent as of all sin, right? And there's a couple reasons for that. One of them is that right now it's their parents' responsibility for them. But that's not the only reason, right? The other reason is that whatever sin is upon them, we'll say, as the result of their birth, was upon everybody, right? And because they're babies, they don't have will of their own to do anything about that condition yet. At some point, they will, with their will. That's not a language accident, by the way, and that's interesting to note. That's not an accident of language. That there's a reason why I phrased it that way and why that phrase works, right? And that's because sin and will are connected, right? And another way to think about this is sin has nothing to do with physicality, insofar as you can be in sin without taking a quote physical action in the world, or with that, right? And so it's disconnected in that way. And what that means is that will is aligning, hopefully, your body, although you don't have full control of your body, and that's the fact you don't have full control of your body is not a sin. That's what you keep describing. The fact you have full control. No one has full control of their body. That's never going to have been you. Sorry. And what that means is that the will is aligning your thoughts, right, with what's outside of you, right? The ethereal realm, the spiritual realm, right? The things that this book is pointing to, the patterns, we'll say, in the world. That are outside of you. That is the job of your will. It does other things too, and hopefully it takes your body along with it, right? That's the argument for the saints. Oh, this person had an unusually long life because they lived an unusually sin-free life, right? That's a common way to believe that those things are linked. I don't think it's necessarily correct, although it's also not necessarily wrong. There's a lot of saints died young, right? So that didn't work out for them. So you making that connection kind of flattens things down and doesn't allow for, again, the problem is if control is the issue, then there's no getting out of any sin, and you shouldn't try. You just shouldn't bother. There's control. You don't have control, and your will is not the control of your body. That is not your will. Your will may be wrapped up in trying to control your body and hopefully controlling it successfully, but that's not what it is, right? There's more going on.
Yeah, it's having dominion over your body. It's not controlling it. But nobody was marking the argument of control. It's like you can mismanage your body. Like you can fail.
What's your difference?
Failure to account for the material reality is sin. Like it's just.
No, failure to align the material reality with the spiritual truth is sin. Not account for.
Well, in order to align something, you need to account for it first.
Yeah, I can account for the physical without doing any work. I mean, saints all the time account for things by ignoring them. That's how they do it. And that's what makes them saints. And this is why the stories of the saints are so important. This is one of the things they show you over and over again. Not all saints. Right? Like some saints lead all the snakes out of Ireland, for example. And that's not the only thing that makes them saints either, right? Because there's not one formula. But a lot of saints refuse to do things in the physical world, despite like eating and drinking, and obviously they are preserved, and so they're not sinning by doing that, and yet they're quote not accounting for things, right? And Yeah, I mean, you'd have to have a definition that of dominion that doesn't involve control for my statement not to be correct. But I don't know that you have one. I'd like to hear it if you do, but I mean, dominion is almost always associated with
my definition of dominion would be working the fields. Like I don't.
If I could add just a few like bits of contrast, it's not actually an argument in favor or against anything. It's just some things that came to mind. I was thinking of two saints and another example. So you have on the bad end, you've got this aspect of like, a single sin of pride in thought was sufficient to turn angels into demons. Like that is a traditionally held belief. But also, you take some of these guys like one of my favorites is Saint Pascal Balon. This guy wore the same monk's habit for like 4 decades or something like that. It was all patched up and ratty and everything. And he wore sandals all the time, including in winter. So he would walk in sandals in the snow. And people were like, why are you walking in sandals in the snow? He's like, well, I had to get over here. And like, he didn't account for it. And then you get other guys like Saint Anthony of Padua, who's like really, really famous guy. And that dude, I'm pretty sure he's the one that knowingly ate poisoned food. Like someone actually made an attempt on his life and he just prayed over the food and then ate it. And then like the people who were there to poison and kill him just looked on in horror as he enjoyed the meal that they poisoned. And like, he just continued to live. Like that was just, so of course there's lots of people who were poisoned and died and everything like that. And we're still very holy people. And the same thing with not only the living a long time, but also like incorrupt bodies. Like there are bodies that are on display that people, like anyone can actually take a flight and like go see them, that have been incorrupt for centuries, and like they're not even in an airtight enclosure or anything like that. And like that's, but also there's lots of very, very holy people who started decomposing immediately. And so it's not necessarily, and maybe even arguably did more stuff or something. So yeah, there's not an easy one and done answer for it.
So returning to the text, it says returning to dust and eating dust, right? Which are the two directions where one is related to Adam dying, right? So it's encapsulated in the spiritual identity, right? And in some sense, I see it as being self-referential, right, can only result in the things that you're built up from and can never go above you, right? So you always will return with the ingredients, but without structure, right? Because you come from the structure, and all you can do is cannibalize it. And the eating dust from the snake's perspective would be having things without form come to you, right? So that would be pure emergence at some sense, right? It's just like taking the structureless and putting it through time. So at the graph below, I see dying as the decoherence to a body, and the falling as the failing to adhere to the head, right? So there's what is it? There's a rebellion while still being identified against the head, and then there's a dissociation from the identity that gives you form. There's 2 stages there.
Well, Manuel, the head and the body are intact in the middle one. The thing that's not intact is the integration of the outside, right, which gets taken up by the chaos instead of accepted, as part of. It's not that. It's like the bottom layers on the graph all the way to the right are just extra things. They're not required, and that's where the issue is.
Ooh,
It's when you try to purify yourself that you
no,
fall.
I don't. I disagree that they're not required. Like they might not be essential, right? Because they might be replaced by other things that could fulfill the same role, right? But
No, then they're
they,
not required. All right, that's fine.
but they are required as offices. They are required.
Maybe, but they're not part of the body. I mean, that's why there's to have question marks and they're fully dark. It's when you try to purify by, like, suppose bodybuilder, you spend all your time bodybuilding, right? And then you don't have a family. Okay, because you're spending all your time bodybuilding, and now your body gets all the attention, and you have a beautiful body for sure. There's no question about that. Oh, there's no that's right, and there's also no potential and no space, right? And right, no space for a family, and so you are closer to the chaos because there's nothing buffering you from the chaos. And then you're going to fall into dying more easily because the chaos is higher. Yeah, because you have isolated yourself by perfecting your body, right? And that's how it works. That we'll say that the personal scale, right? But it works that way at the government scale too, right? Like if you have a government and you lock down your borders so you don't let anybody else in, eventually the chaos is going to increase, right? Because you'll get too much inbreeding. Now, that may take a long time in a modern country with millions of people, but this wasn't, designed for that. And also that works at scale, right? All you're doing with people at that point is changing time frame. You're not changing what happens. It might take longer, but it's still going to happen. And that's why you can't have a country with no immigration. Of course, that's almost never been done in history. And all the times it has been done, we don't have any records because they got wiped out. That might be a hint. But you have to manage it too, right? Otherwise, the chaos comes flooding in, and then you have a different type of falling and dying. But this is just showing you that you need to leave space for the potential, and if you don't, you fall. Like if you try to perfect the world, if you build your Tower of Babel, right?
No. Like I read this completely differently. Like what I see on the right is a body, right? And then the question marks come in as questioning the functionality, right? Because it can't respond to the head, right? And that's what falling is, right? Like if your feet don't respond to your head, you stumble. Like so it's a
you're allowed
stumbling
to stumble.
stone.
That's
It's a
not.
stumbling stone inside the body instead of outside.
I mean, you have those in regard. You're never getting rid of that. Like that doesn't.
I'm not saying you're going to get rid of it. I'm just saying that
Yeah,
that's what.
but then the middle diagram couldn't exist.
No. Like
That's
you can lay on the ground, right? And when you lay on the ground, you can restore your feet so you can walk again, get food and shit, or you can just fucking die. Like it's.
I don't know how that's related to the diagram or the falling.
Well, that's what the diagram says, right? If you fall, right? If your feet no longer sustain you, then you end up dying. That's what it says. Like if you don't have
that's not what it says. Like
okay.
that's not at all what it says. Again, it's the chaos that rises, and the chaos rises as the result of the unintegrated items being below the chaos. They don't go away.
No, they fall away from the body. They decohere.
There's no evidence that they fell away from the body or decohered.
That's
and falling
what it says.
Is the result. But falling is also the result of an action. It's not. It's
no,
not
the falling
is
the result of the snake or an external influence or time. That's why falling happens. Like you have a body and time affects the body.
Fall. The snake doesn't cause the fall. That's true, but that's not a fall. Like the saints didn't fall, and they still died. You can die without falling. That's not a big
No,
deal.
the saints didn't die. Like they're alive.
Okay, they still return to dust though.
Their bodies do.
Which is
Yeah, like
yes, without falling, right. But the integration is important, right? Because things happen due to actions, and those actions need to be aligned by your will with something outside of your will or spiritual.
no,
or
things
ethereal.
happen. Like what are you talking about? Things happen due to actions. Things happen.
Yeah.
Right. Like things happen. Like
Yeah.
and either you respond properly, which means that you're in the garden, or you don't respond properly, right? And then you need to
Things happen whether you
artificially,
respond or not, and you're sinful only if you respond inappropriately to something.
or you're sinful if you're not properly covered by your clothing.
Okay, if you fail to take the action of properly clothing yourself, that is true.
Yes,
the
that's what I
failure
was
of your
talking
action.
about the whole time.
Well, that's the failure of your action. Yeah, you can always have a failure of action that leads you to sin. Yeah.
But there's also, I'm thinking of a couple of other saint examples because it's also like it's so difficult because there's so much variety. So I'm thinking of like, a lot of people talk about Saint Thomas Aquinas for his academic achievements and stuff, but there was actually an incident right when he became like a friar, I think, and his father didn't want him to do it. And so he was essentially winding up having to turn away from his father, who was very wealthy. And he had to, and I think this also happened, something like this also happened with probably St. Francis, but I think it was specifically St. Thomas, that there was this thing where he wound up, the father said, oh, you wasted all of the money that I gave you and all these sorts of things, and including like the clothes that I bought you and all these things. And he actually undressed right there in public, gave his father the clothes, and then walked into the monastery and like just received his habit and everything. But there was an aspect of kind of like completely unclothing going on there. And then also famously, like St. Francis of Assisi is kind of like, one of the heavy hitters of the saints, but he's also the crazy deacon that would walk around, like was known to have walked around naked a couple of times and talked to animals as well. And so that guy was also, he was a very, like that guy was naked in many different ways. And somehow managed to not scandalize people. I don't know how he did that. Well, like, I don't have an answer to that. I'm just giving you a couple of do you think, okay.
William Blake is famous for walking in his garden naked, talking to angels in the trees. Who we had conversations with, right? So yeah, I mean, these things, and that's the thing. Like, yes, these things happen, right? But whether or not it's sin is a matter of alignment with something spiritual. It has nothing to do with the thing. And again, anything could be sinful or not because context matters. And the context is what's the orientation towards the thing, the spiritual thing, the highest thing.
When we see this this diagram, I mean, the thing is, like, I think visually. So I'm looking at this, right to left, and thinking, are we getting kind of a if we're looking at the personal scale, could we look at this sort of like a leper who's right leg has started to fail him, that's facing us, and now he's kind of falling apart as we're going right to left? Or are we looking at something like there's somebody that's walking through muddy water, like a creek or something like that, and their boots get stuck in the mud, and then now like they wind up losing that, and then now they're without that in this sort of muddy creek, and now they get overwhelmed by the fact that they're no longer covered, they no longer have traction, and they slip and then get carried off by the stream. Like, are either of those images kind of useful? Because I guess just I look at this and I just see like both little stories kind of play out. I don't know if that's useful.
No, I think both would work for me. Because like the way I see the middle one is it's like the corpus, right? So you have the vital parts effectively, right? Or in another sense, that which allows the connectivity towards the expression, right? So you have the head, you have the organization, and then you have the implementation, right?
Mm.
And I see the bottom row as the implementation, right? So like shoes, right? They're exchangeable, right? Or like feet, right? You can use feet to crawl, to swim, to walk, right? Like this, you can walk in different manners, right? Like there's all sorts of ways in which the bottom part would be interchangeable, right? But they're still necessary, because if you can't move, right, like the body isn't bodying anymore, right? Like now it's a handicapped body, right? And you could argue the same for shoes, right? Like if you need shoes for walking in the mud or whatever, right? Because else you'll slip, then the loss of the shoes would be the same as stumbling.
Yeah, I guess where I'm just kind of thinking, you know, as I'm addressing discrepancies as my intention for today, I'm just thinking, like, when we look at it, we can look at it from multiple perspectives, of course, but I guess I'm going back and forth between this aspect of, you have the foreign sort of like the garment that is covering, that you can kind of more or less afford to lose but would rather not lose, on the right, you know, losing a shoe or something like that, versus, you know, is the middle one a person who's shoeless, or is it an amputee? Like, I guess, like, the implications of either one would be drastically different.
I think also on the next page in the book, he takes that far right diagram here and relates that to being dressed or undressed. Like the being uncovered causes the falling in some sense.
Okay, so probably the shoes.
Yeah, but you could also say posture or something, right? Like it's just an affordance that is cultivated in some sense. So, because go ahead, Chris.
Oh, I was just thinking, you know, I was just thinking, you know, when Ahab loses his leg, he gets dressed with a peg leg instead of falling over. Just to reference the other book. For how you get artificially dressed or not.
And I think you also have to, like, we talked about healing and being whole, right? And so, like, what is being healing or being made whole? Well, like, that's basically coming together as a new body, right? So like if you lose your capacity, right, like you become someone else. So you could just say, like, you're in the army and you're a major, right, and you get fired. Like you lose a bunch of ability to do things. So, like, are you the same? No, right? Because the way that you're in the world is different, but you're still, in another way, you are the same, right? and and like you need to rebalance, right? Like, just like the fact that you don't go to work anymore, right, means that you have to organize your day differently, right? You have to adhere to different principles, right? Like different structures that organize your day. um so and like that's also the peg leg, right? It's like, well, you still get to walk, but, like, are you the same person? Like,
Is that kind of what we're seeing with that even though the sort of dotted lines are now reconnected, now there's another question mark, you know, like another point has now appeared under the water there, and the water level hasn't changed. But there is something missing when the artificial covering happens.
Right. So you get a new equilibrium, right? So let's say I don't know, like let's say I do martial arts or something, right, to gain certain abilities, right? So now I have these abilities, and now there's still things that fall outside of me, I guess, right? Like there's still the things I can't integrate. Um, so or I don't know, like I'm like I put on this winter coat, right? But how do I deal with heat? like there's always this thing as a consequence of the winter coat, heat becomes different, right? So that's not
Yeah,
an issue on the left side.
yeah, you're being more consistent with your dress or whatever. You're trying to maintain a consistency, but it's still not complete for everything. There's still the things outside of it that you encounter that have to
And
deal with.
yeah, and we see that in the governments, right? So they end up making laws, right? And then they keep finding the thing outside of the law, and they need to make an exception on an exception on an exception on an exception. And at a certain point, right, like this was what Mark was talking about, right? Like it becomes ridiculous, right? And then the sin becomes the excessive, right? Like making the body too big, so that it can't carry any weight anymore, or it can't move anymore because the coat is like there's too many clothing.
I think there was a video from some movie from a few decades back where it was kind of talking about, it was like a scenario where the military is trying to design a brand new tank. They need it by next year, right? It's okay. We need to deploy this thing. We need a new tank. And so they have all their engineers and their designers and their committees come together, and it all has to go through an approval process and stuff. And they're like, okay, this is great, but also we need it to be amphibious, but also we need it to be able to fit 8 people and not 6. And then also we need to be able to have all this additional, room for, spare ammunition and all these other things. And then by the time it's done, it's been like 20 or 30 years. And, it's like there's no need for it anymore. And it's impossible to make, because it's just wildly expensive. You can make one,
That's what happened to the F-35, I think. Like it was a jack of all trades, and then it ended up being a jack of none.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like
it was $1 billion to produce one of those. It's like nice.
I want to respond to this question because I think it's important to discuss a little bit. Yeah, how do we treat the question marks?
I mean, it's just like the unknown implementation, something like that, or like you were talking about.
It's something that isn't integrated or something you don't know how to integrate.
Right.
So you have to either incorporate it or leave it outside, and either decide how you're going to account for it or ignore it.
Right. So I would say that it's something that's not in adherence to the identity of the head. Right. So either you can make it adhere by dressing it up, right? Like so putting a structure around it that will allow it to fulfill the function that is required by the head, or you have to exclude it from right, like Mitchell Clark said, like yes, it can be accounted for by leaving it outside, by saying you don't get to participate. That's a way to account for things.
It's
yes.
like lawn flamingos and garden gnomes.
Oh, so what is this? Yes, you don't have to account for things. This is the easy answer, and if there's no need to account for things, you're better off not accounting for that.
And sometimes having excess is just an opportunity to be able to give that to somebody else as well. Like this, that you oftentimes will, you trade with your excess, or, you you make a sacrifice of the excess for the purpose of increasing, some other relationship. Like, it doesn't all, it's not just like not integrating is not the same thing necessarily as rejecting absolutely everything. Like, it can have a use outside of you or even your community that is better for somebody else's integration.
All right. So at the line above the diagram, it says they sewed fake leaves together, right? So it's interesting that sewing is introduced here as an activity. So I saw that like as an artificial pattern, right? A connection, and I think maybe the best way to see it is connecting two areas, right? Like, so you have one piece of cloth that's sewed against another piece of cloth, right? So you're connecting to things that had their own identity, had their own thing, and you now make them one. So you could see that as a trade agreement would fulfill that function, for example, right? You have two separate authorities that now have a way to interface. Another thing that I want to mention is when we're talking about dressing, that's something that requires effort, right? It requires maintenance, it requires sustenance, right? And therefore, it's suboptimal compared to the state in the garden. All right. So you could also, in some sense, well, to go back to the example of a tent, right? So a tent is also a covering. It's also like a hierarchy, right? Like it's a top point with a spread. It creates a space, and I think the space element, right? You can also have spacious clothes, right? So these spacious clothes, they can hide things, they can hold things, right? They can have deformations, or even you can put things in pockets, for example, right? So there's all of these things that have uh, well, let's just say, well, or a diaper, for example, right? Like maybe a diaper is a really good example. I'm dealing with my nephew. It's like, okay, like there's some nakedness of you, right? Like you can't control your bladder. That nakedness of you can be disguised, right? Like you can be made functional in the sense that like you get to relieve yourself without exposing yourself, like in the social sense, but also exposing yourself in the sense of, okay, now you're dirtied, right? Like you can no longer interface with the world properly anymore. So that would be something that would go against functioning, right? At least, and maybe not his intention, but at least my intention for him. So, like that covering allows for that.
Yeah, I think I'm looking at just Mitchell's kind of mentioning that he's a size large, but he wears an XL hoodie for comfort. That there is also this aspect of kind of being able to have additional room, like you mentioned. There is an aspect of sort of nakedness when it comes to pockets. Say if you have if you have a wallet or something like that, and you're wearing pants that aren't particularly baggy, like anyone can notice that you have a wallet in that pocket or something like that. And so sometimes there is an advantage of additional concealment by having unnecessarily larger clothes, or also just kind of the aspect of concealment as a whole. Like, also, if you think of like a tent as concealment or something like that, there's more room for you to be able to fit additional things. And and kind of cover that additional nakedness. So if there's something you think of like, there was this guy, unfortunately he passed away this year, but there is this guy on YouTube called Paul Harrell. And he was one of those guys that was, he did like firearms videos and stuff like that. And this guy he did this for like over a decade, and he had this big like khaki jacket, and he would be there and he would look like just he'd just look like himself, just wearing this jacket and everything. And then he would go and he'd start demonstrating a bunch of things. And he did like bushcraft stuff and everything. It was full of pockets, and he would just start pulling out, like just no cuts or anything like that, pulling out various different firearms and bushcraft items and tools and all these different things from his jacket and all these different compartments. And it's like he was able to fit all that and completely conceal all of them. And there was like a lot of the times, but there is, and he was like former law enforcement and stuff. But yeah, there was something really interesting about that of just being able to make good use of that additional space within your covering.
And I think if you look at a tent, it's also a home, and you get to store things at your home that you're not dragging with you, right? But even you drag the tent with you, right? So you have it's a weird in between space.
Yeah, you could also have like an extra large raincoat, right? And then it's a raincoat, right? So it covers you from the rain. And then either you can put that over an existing other thing for warmth, or maybe additionally put something in it to protect that other thing from the rain, as though it's part of your flesh. Right.
Bicycles, that's the thing that we do in the Netherlands.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like you can incorporate things under your protection using artificial covering, and make them accounted for by you against the elements, for example. And that's part of what this dressing is. And yeah, to Mitchell's excellent point, it doesn't have to be, quote, yours. Like, there's an efficiency thing that we have that is bogus. Too much efficiency is bad, irrespective of all other factors, even the inability to define efficiency in a universally acceptable way. So that's actually really important to know. And I don't think people sort of realize that. I think they look at that and say, it's extra large is a waste. It's like, well, it depends on a lot of factors.
So yeah, to go with the raincoat, right? Like, so when you're on a bicycle, you have to move your legs, right? Like, they're really exposed to rain. So if you have a raincoat that covers your steering wheel, right, and your hands with the steering wheel, now you have the space beneath that where your legs are also covered, and you can just, like, in that space have the movement, right? Because you need to do the crazy movement. And alternatively, you could wear raincoat pants, right? But they have different issues because like but yeah. So at the bottom of the page, it says you will neither eat it nor touch it lest you die. So it's interesting that the fruit of the tree also is not allowed to be touched, right? So just exposure, even without integrating, right? Or trying to integrate, just the exposure to the fruit is already affecting you in a manner.
Well, in a sense, the tree is naked as well, right? Like, it's been pointed out, like, this is the one, like that one specifically, so that like you can't touch, you can't eat, like, just none of this explicitly. This one right here. All the other ones are okay, just not this.
Well, it's been laid bare, or revealed, or made known to you. Didn't say anything different.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, it is covered by the word of God, right? So it is under the protection of God in a sense, right? So and like now we're getting back to the flipping of the framing, right? Because it's naked from your perspective, right? It's naked from the snake's perspective, but it's not naked from the God perspective.
Well,
And
yeah, that's a good catch, Manuel, because yeah, you notice the diagram says artificially covered. That's right, because there's some frame where everything's covered. It's sort of like a blanket insurance policy. It's like, and yeah, that is a significant difference. So yeah, it's a really good idea to point that out. It's not like the tree wasn't covered. The tree was covered. you were told. It's like, yes, the tree was covered, and you were told basically not to treat it as though it were revealed or had been laid bare. And what does the tree do? The tree reveals. Right? You were told not to reveal, yourself or by yourself or something, lest bad things happen, right? And not necessarily, quote, as a result of a curse, but or direct curse as we think of them in, we'll say, recent times, but as the result of your action and the fact that things have relationship like gravity, irrespective of your or others' will, right? And it's not that God can't suspend gravity for you for a time for a specific reason. It's that the rule is that gravity is going to pull down upon you, and you could see that as a curse if you want, I suppose. But I don't know if it's helpful.
so at the footnote, we go into the idea of dressing, right? So you can dress animals, right? Like remind yourself that a dress is a feminine piece of clothing that's supposed to be beautiful, right? So there's a beauty component in there as well. And the thing that came up for me is salad dressing, right? Where you dress up the taste. That's also something associated with beauty. So the beauty also, so there's an artificial component that's pointed at elegance, I guess. Maybe that's the best word. In it's yeah, it's not utilitarian. Let's just say it that way. It's like what is it covering, right? Like it's covering. It's like a spiritual covering, right? So it's supposed to properly fulfill the identity, right? That it's given, and dressing enhances the identity, right? So it's the technology that participates in the identity. Maybe that's the best way to say it.
So it's funny. I'm just thinking about salad dressing now. This thing of taste. So last week I mentioned that there's that brutal line that Solomon has where he says that a beautiful woman without discretion is like a gold ring in the nose of a pig, basically, is what he says. But it's also negative contrast because it's like, that. And Matthieu actually pointed this out in a totally separate thing where he says that the word that's translated normally into discretion in Hebrew is also commonly used as taste, like, oh, that person has good taste in music or food or whatever. And so this thing of like, oh, a woman who has no sense of taste or ability to like check on something and see like, oh, is this good? Like, let me just kind of sample that and see, is it good or should I get rid of it, or do we need more of this or whatever? And then it's a sort of negative contrast of how great is it then that that she's pretty and she has taste. Like that's amazing. But also this thing of that if you're dressing up a salad, then it was something that you probably weren't going to eat on its own, and so you're kind of artificially adding more taste, and you're outsourcing the taste a little bit. So it's you're introducing this additional element so that you can wind up eating it despite the fact that maybe if you engage with it initially, and if it's just like a spinach salad that's just straight spinach, that you probably wouldn't just sit there eating it. That you're kind of adding this to maybe even suppress the process of discretion or taste. so that you can get more of it into you.
That also goes into you need truth, beauty, and goodness, not just one.
Yeah.
So
Just eat your greens. That's true.
So I think it's interesting, right? Because like, what is taste when we're talking about taste with dresses or taste with food or something, right? Like it's like an anticipation, right? Like it's an announcement of what is to come, right? Like, because like the function of the food is in your stomach, right? Like getting giving its nutrients to you. It's not in your mouth, right? But the mouth is in some sense anticipating how it's going to end up in your stomach, but like it's not precise, right? Like it doesn't give an actual answer, and it's relating to an unknown, right? Like, because the food that you put in your mouth, like there's no way whether you know it's poison or not, right? So the taste is in some sense it's trying to filter out whether what you're taking in is actually gonna uh, be a blessing or a curse, right? Yeah, and I think this goes into this, right? So building a salad, right, which is like following a recipe or like doing to like you put chunks together, right? Or you make one, or you participate in it where you allow the being of the salad, right? Like you get a whiff of what the tasting is going to be like, right? You anticipate the taste, or eating it as such. So we already talked about this at the top of the page, but it says you will not die for certain, right? So there's a promise in there from the snake, right? There's an invitation in the promise. Um, so now I want to go to the diagram. So the naturally falling is like a regression, right? It's a returning to a previous state, or disintegration. And the compensation, or the artificial standing, is a compensation to um, the lack, right? And losing balance is losing the ability to stand, right? Like it's so it's that's the recognition of a lack. um,
Well, I'm thinking a little bit of this sort of, artificially standing so that you don't lose balance. I'm thinking a little bit of that thing, where people go and they have like those weddings and like the sort of modern rite where they have the like the groomsmen and stuff, and they go and they're all just standing totally straight, trying to stand as straight as they possibly can, and then they lock their knees and like somebody passes out. Like you're supposed to kind of like actually change your stance a little bit and maybe even kind of like shift a little bit so that you don't wind up naturally falling because of your blood flow gets messed up or whatever it is that happens when your knees lock.
yeah, so RJ is saying like the covering is a barrier. I I think it can be many things, right? Because you when you break your leg, you can make a scaffolding, right, that holds it up. There's many ways to cover things that strengthen, things that prevent exposure, uh, things that mediate, right? Like, so you could have like a membrane, like a mask that will allow certain things to enter your body and certain things not to enter your body. So I think that covering aspect has different dimensions.
Yeah, again,
Yeah.
the covering can't do only one thing, like with the umbrella, right? The covering that holds the rain away and quote covers the umbrella, and it usually does that in two ways, right? One when it's closed, one way when it's closed, and one way when it's open. But when it's open and able to, we'll say, fend off the rain effectively or most effectively, it's also holding the spines of the umbrella together so that it can be properly opened and closed. But I mean, it's part of all that, and that's part of the important part, is that you have to account for that dual nature of the covering, and also unexposing it in a way veils it, but that also allows you to interface with it correctly in the same way that Noah was, right? Because you guys brought that up earlier, right? Like, it's fine if he's in his tent, but if you go into the tent, now it's not fine, because if you're in the tent, then there's a problem. But you didn't belong there in the first place, by the way, and to the extent that you did, there's a proper procedure to be followed, right? To veil, because it's important. And that's like, everybody wants everything unveiled. No, you really don't. That's really not the right way to engage.
Yeah, I like that point, right? Like, he didn't belong in the tent; he invaded. So that's a transgression of a covering, right? An artificial transgression on the artificial boundary. So yeah, I was looking at the graph a little bit, right? And the biting of the heel is not necessarily bad, in the sense that it can bring renewal, right? Like natural renewal, not artificial renewal. So in some sense, burning of that wood would be in that component, right? Like, the things that you no longer need, right? That don't sustain you, they shouldn't be part of your body, right? So they should fall off. It's like the leaves falling off a tree in autumn, right? That's also in some sense part of the body being ejected, I guess. And the tree becomes naked in order to endure winter. But yeah, it was interesting to me that it's some sense it's a creation of two worlds, right? So you have the world of response, and you have the world of well, I was going to say responsibility. You have being subjected, or you have making things object, right? You classify them, and you respond to them in some sense. But yeah, like, it creates at least in my mind, it creates something like a two worlds system there. And well, you can actually see that some people would privilege one approach over the other. That's also interesting. There's like a reliance on the natural healing that happens after the poisoning of the heel. That some people seem to have an addiction to. Yeah, then I'm mostly done. I only have something at the end of the chapter, so if someone else has something that they want to bring up.
I mean, he does, talk about adding enmity between the woman and the snake, right? So that's That's significant. Right? In other words, everything got along peacefully in the garden until this. And then all of a sudden, bang, there's going to be a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. You said your seed and her seed, right? So there's two ways of having seed, right? One is from the ground and one is from the woman, which is, it's the proper holder of the seed or something. And I think the distinction with the ground and the woman is that the woman takes responsibility or care for the seed, while the ground doesn't, right? And that's why you need to work it.
Yeah, I mean, I just looked at it more as a generational curse.
No, I get it, right? But there's what I'm trying to point out is that there, I guess, two means of propagation, right? So basically, you can make it like, I can build a dynasty in the sense of having a family, or I can build a dynasty by having a company or something, right? Where there's one of them you build from the earth, and the other one you build more in spirit. That makes sense.
I was thinking a little bit about this bit of near the end where it says nakedness was not synonymous with falling and dying. So we've kind of talked about this aspect of like exposing another person or something like that, whether it's even has nothing to do with their clothes or any of that sort of thing. But there is an aspect, and this we talked a little bit about like some material examples of sometimes it's appropriate and maybe not even bad for a person to expose themselves for a specific purpose. But also I was thinking about honesty. So like, again, not in the material realm, you have this aspect of like being open about something, or you talked about sort of like testimony in the past or something like that, where you can that by kind of demonstrating that sort of openness or honesty, that you kind of make yourself or you lay bare some specific truth by even pointing out your own ignorance in some specific scenario or some sort of example that a person can relate to. And in that way, that winds up being a sort of opportunity for compatibility, or maybe being able to like communicate a specific principle to somebody by removing that additional layering of social decorum, or I'm going to keep certain private things private. But if someone's going through something very specific and you have an example that they can relate to, sometimes it's necessary to give that information over, whereas a lot of people would feel very, very afraid of sharing. I mean, I've talked to people who are afraid of even saying like what they ate one day. They're saying, I had a wonderful breakfast, and it's like, oh yeah, what'd you have? Why? And it's just like, all right, we're not going to have this conversation then, I guess, because that's just but it's like, what is so there's sort of a fear of falling and dying, it seems like, with trying to even expose the tiniest little detail of some peripheral thing, whereas you can really make a lot of progress, or at least you can make a very high contrast demonstration by removing a certain number of layerings appropriately at the right time with the right person.
Yeah, I think bearing something allows things to happen that can't happen any other way. So there's a like just look at it as a doctor, right, needing to undress you to check your health or something, right, or to check your wound. If you keep your wound dressed, they can't relate to it, right? They can't see, they can't deal with it.
I think also of like driver's license, like showing your driver's license to a police officer or something like that, or even to like if you're applying for something, that it's like giving identification is itself kind of a submission.
Well, or failing to show a driver's license.
Right. That also exposes you a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the next page, at the end of the first paragraph, it says the technology of clothing is a form of subjugation which imposes meaning and purpose. Right. So there's a direction there, right? Like there's the imposition of will, right, and the having the world or conform to you. Um,
Yeah, so I think a lot of the I mean, I always bring up that sort of thing of the condescension to playing chess, or any other sort of game. That there's also that sort of condescension also happening where you're kind of pigeonholing yourself into a certain identity for the purpose of, say, like a team sport or something like that. You might have something of that sort, or being identified even, just with like a pin of being part of like a volunteer organization, or some sort of thing with a specific, like that with like a formal event. Oh, everyone's going to have this sort of dress code or something like that. And it's not necessarily, maybe it's not even necessarily formal, but we're all going to agree to, this type of decorum. That itself it's a constraint that you're condescending to, that also opens up the possibility of engaging in a specific way you couldn't otherwise.
Yeah, so at the end it says, as discussed in the following chapters, is anticipation to next week. The continual back and forth between artificially dressing and naturally falling asleep is experienced as working and sleeping. And so I kind of reframe that as attending to something, right? So there's if you attend to something, you lift it up, right? Like you bring it up, you work on it, right? Like you engage with it, and then the sleeping is a releasing, right? It's a disengagement. It's allowing things to take its natural shape, right? So it, you can look at it from the perspective as I have with my 1.5 year old nephew, right? Like if I attend to him too much, right? Like then he starts getting frustrated in his own manner, right? Like he can't fully express himself, right? And then I need to release him, right? I need to let him enact his own will instead of engage with my will, in order for him to properly participate, right? And like at a certain point that even ends, right? Like that dynamic ends, and then he actually needs to sleep to restore, because else he's over impressed, like yeah, he gets too much impression, Jim. Whatever. um so yeah, like this sleeping and this disengagement is also, in some sense, um relieving us from being dominated by whatever we're attending to, right? Because like everything is reciprocal. Like our attention, when we attend to something, it attends to us, right? Like if you look into the abyss stares back into you. So like don't attend to things too much, because they will start taking control over your life.
I think that's part of the rest and like the place of taking a break from the artificial space or whatever, is that you can refocus.
Right. Refocus and recontextualize. Both of those are
Yes.
important. So, in our reflection, what are we gonna do? I think this idea of artificiality, like the covering, like in what ways are we covering, and in some sense also like what is the cost of covering, right? Because that's that's the thing that's most often ignored when when we're talking about things in our lives where like it's important to cover. They also take away from other things, right? So I think it's important to maybe see something of that and how we can engage with that in our lives as a reflection. Also, the people in the chat, please leave any questions and feel free to participate in the reflection and share your results. We'll take a minute of silence, look up, and try to see what comes at us. Well, who has something that they want to share?
I was thinking a little bit of so I had mentioned that like multiple people have recently told me to rest, and I was thinking about this thing of like the artificial covering within the bounds of that. So I had actually it was something that I had my my primary confessor told me. He was like, "Look, the thing was that he was saying that there's a certain aspect of trusting in God at the communal level, and I was like, oh, I realized that I was being kind of like an individual again. That I was like, and I didn't realize that I was doing that because I was thinking of other people as well, but it was still an individualistic mindset of, oh, these other individuals who are also competent in doing stuff, but not thinking of like the community. And he was like, look, there's actually an aspect that is going to hold anybody back, of that if you're not also trusting that God's got not only your problems set up, but that you can actually not have to go and cover for all of these people all the time, that it's still gonna like turn out okay. That and that you need to be able to actually rest, otherwise you're going to grind yourself into the ground and everything. And I realized like, oh, this was something I was doing where I was compromising on my my morning rituals. And I was like, you know, they're fairly involved, but I was kind of falling back onto some I had some sort of crutches that I had kind of set up for myself, where I was like, well, you know, I can do these things and actually be in a focused state, or I can follow along with some of my my sort of prayer regimen in the morning, along with recordings. Let myself be kind of led by that. Sometimes that's the type of thing where if I have like a horrific sort of scenario and I sleep through an alarm or something like that, that's a nice little recovery option. But I was using that for like weeks, maybe even like over a month, probably more than a month. And I realized like I was just getting more and more tired. And I had mentioned on a previous book club, like, you know, it's only after I actually do all of that stuff in the morning that I feel rested, not after I wake up. So I was just tired all the time. And I was like, well, I'm still doing the stuff, but I wasn't actually giving 100%. It was, I'm listening to the recording so that I can also catch up on cooking and cleaning and stuff like that before work starts in the morning. And because I was kind of afraid of like, oh gosh, well, if I don't do this now, then I'm going to have to do that stuff later. I'll have to find time in between in order to do all these things. And then I was like, oh, well, I have to keep up with entropy. And like, you know, other people aren't going to help you do all this other stuff. So I had that whole mindset. And then I get that advice, and it's like, okay, like that's just by all appearances, it looks like it's not going to work. But let me try like I did literally for like 2 years before this, when it wasn't a problem, and then do it. And then lo and behold, like actually everything worked out, and it was still okay, and I didn't have to like, you know, work an extra hour for free in the morning like I had been for over a month and all these other things. Like it still turned out okay. And that kind of ties in, I guess, a bit with Jordan Peterson's thing of like not doing things for other people that they can do for themselves. That sometimes it's necessary to just, you know, handle the entropy because it's getting overrun and other people aren't doing it. But also, you can only do that for so long. And maybe if you at least give that little boost and then you let go, like people actually will go and do it. And I wasn't in that mode yet. I was like, no, now this is just my existence. I have to accept my new reality that I'm constantly picking this stuff up. And it was like, no, people actually did step up and I didn't have to say anything. And I probably could have done it way sooner and not wiped myself out. So that's sort of my reflection.
Anyone else? I guess I'll share my thing. So I went over into habits, right? Because like habits are addressing of responsibility in some sense, right? Like it covers the responsibility. And then I was like, okay, like how do you break a habit, right? Well, you need to be invited out of it into something else, right? And it's like, well, that's not something that you can do for yourself, right? Like inviting yourself out of something, like that's like self-referential stuff. That kind of doesn't work, right? So now there's a like that's actually in the domain of others, right? Like others have a responsibility towards people to get you out of your bad habits, right? Like or the habits that tie you down, at least, and make a little bit room, right? Loosen things so that you can find yourself, find your way. And well, Mark is at a alien space, and I'm at a alien space. And like, what's that? Well, that's vacation, right? Like, what's vacation? Well, you vacate space, right? Like you make space in order for other things to happen to get into your life, right? So like what that's changing surroundings, right? Like it's also changing the patterns of participation, right? Because if you're on vacation, like you're usually not working, and the way that you're relating uh, to your household and stuff is different. And also you change the way that you relate to people, right? So if you're with people and you're on vacation, then the activities that you engage with, the, the way that you manifest rituals, like usually you come together because of a certain reason, right? Like, so you have uh, Thanksgiving, right? In the Netherlands, we have St. Nicholas festival, right? So you have these rituals that you do together in these events, right? That are unique to that point in time, right? So all of these things, they drag you out of your coverings, and they allow you to readjust or design new clothing when you re-engage with the world. Okay, well, I think that's kind of it. I'll make an end to this. Everybody, thanks for watching. Thanks for the participation in chat. Sorry that I kind of missed out on the first bit, but I think it was actually amazing because there was a lot of back and forth going on, and there was an actual active contribution to what happened in the book club. So I'm really glad. See you all next week.